I didn't realize the moment my daughter-in-law smiled and raised her glass at my birthday dinner would be the exact moment she decided I no longer belonged in my own family. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and until that evening, I believed I had built something unbreakable, a home filled with love, sacrifice, and loyalty. The dining room was glowing with soft yellow light, the kind I had always preferred because it made everything feel warmer, gentler, more forgiving. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing the meal myself, even though my son Daniel insisted we could order catering. But I needed to do it. Cooking was how I showed love, how I reminded myself I still had a place here. The roasted chicken, the green beans with almonds, the mashed potatoes whipped just the way Daniel liked since he was a boy. It all sat neatly on the table I had polished that very morning. And at the center of it all was the cake, a simple vanilla buttercream, because my granddaughter Emma once told me it was her favorite. I remember how proud I felt watching everyone take their seats, hearing the soft clinking of forks and glasses, the quiet laughter drifting through the room like something out of a memory I never wanted to lose. Linda, my daughter-in-law, sat across from me, perfectly composed as always, her posture straight, her smile precise. She had a way of making everything look effortless, as if life naturally arranged itself around her. When Daniel married her 5 years ago, I told everyone how lucky we were. I meant it. I truly believed she brought stability into his life, something I had worried about ever since his father passed. For years, I tried to be the kind of mother-in-law no one could complain about. I never interfered, never raised my voice, never questioned her decisions, even when they stung. I told myself that love sometimes meant stepping back. That night, as candles flickered and the room filled with that familiar comfort, Linda gently tapped her glass with a spoon. The soft ringing cut through the chatter, and everyone turned to her. "I just want to say something," she began, her voice smooth, measured, almost too calm. I remember smiling at her, expecting something kind, something thoughtful. After all, it was my birthday. She looked at me directly, her eyes steady, unreadable. And for a split second, something inside me shifted, like a quiet warning I couldn't quite grasp. "Margaret has done so much for this family," she said, and the room responded with polite nods. I felt a small warmth in my chest, a reassurance that maybe all my efforts had been seen after all. But then she paused, just long enough for the silence to stretch. "But," she continued, her tone changing in a way that made my fingers tighten around my napkin, "there comes a time when we have to move forward and make space for new priorities." I didn't understand at first. No one did. Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing between us, confusion written all over his face. Emma stopped playing with her fork. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against my chest. I forced a small laugh, thinking maybe this was leading somewhere lighthearted, some kind of modern toast I didn't quite follow. "What do you mean, dear?" I asked gently, keeping my voice steady the way I always had. Linda smiled again, but this time it didn't reach her eyes. "I mean," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table, "it's time we start making decisions that reflect the future of this household." And in that moment, sitting at the head of the table I had owned for over 30 years, surrounded by the people I had given everything to, I felt something I had never felt before. Not anger, not sadness, but a quiet, creeping realization that I was about to be erased in a way I never saw coming. By the time the last of the dishes were cleared from the dining table, I could feel a quiet shift in the room, the kind that does not announce itself loudly but settles into your bones like a cold draft through a closed window. And I noticed how my daughter-in-law avoided my eyes while speaking to the others, how she laughed just a little too brightly at jokes that were not that funny, and how my own son, the boy I raised with careful hands and sleepless nights, kept glancing at her as if waiting for permission before he said anything at all. And that was when I realized something was not right, not in the way families sometimes argue and then move on, but in a deeper, more deliberate way that made my chest tighten with a quiet understanding I was not yet ready to name. So I excused myself and stepped into the hallway, pretending to check my phone even though there was nothing there, just to give myself a moment to breathe and collect the pieces of what I had been sensing all evening. And as I stood there, I overheard her voice from the kitchen, low but sharp enough to carry, saying that it would be better if I started thinking about downsizing, that the house was too much for someone my age, and that it would make more sense for them to take over things before it became a problem. And I felt something inside me go still, not broken, not shattered, just very, very still, because I understood then that this was not concern, this was planning, and I had not been invited into the conversation about my own life. And I stayed quiet, listening as my son murmured something in agreement, his voice uncertain but not refusing, and that hurt more than anything else. Not because he was against me outright, but because he was willing to let someone else decide what should happen to me. And I thought about all the years I had worked to keep that house, every mortgage payment, every repair, every holiday hosted under that roof, and how I had always believed it would be a place where I was safe, where I belonged, and now I could hear them discussing it like it was already theirs, like I was just a temporary guest who had overstayed her welcome, and I realized I had been seeing small signs for months. The way she would reorganize my kitchen without asking. The way she spoke about future plans that did not include me unless it was convenient. The way my son had slowly stopped calling me first when something important happened, and I had brushed it all aside because I wanted peace, because I believed that love and patience would be enough to keep a family together. But standing there in that quiet hallway, listening to my life being rearranged without my consent, I understood that patience without boundaries is not kindness, it is permission, and I had given them too much of it. So I straightened my shoulders, took a slow breath, and walked back into the room. With a calm I did not quite feel yet, but knew I would need. Because whatever was coming next, I was no longer going to pretend I did not see it. And I was no longer going to let anyone decide my place in my own home without hearing my voice first. When I sat back down at the table, no one seemed to notice anything had changed, but everything had, at least for me. And I watched them differently now. Not with the soft blur of a mother who wanted harmony at any cost, but with clear eyes that picked up every hesitation, every glance, every small signal that had once slipped past me. And I saw how she leaned slightly toward my son when she spoke, how her hand rested on his arm just long enough to guide him without making it obvious, and how he followed that guidance without even realizing it. And I understood that whatever conversation had been happening behind my back had been going on for longer than just tonight. It had roots, and I had simply not looked closely enough to see them growing. So I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate, buying myself a moment to decide how I would respond, because I knew I had two choices. I could continue pretending, smiling through dinners like this while slowly being pushed out of my own life, or I could begin to take back control in a way that was quiet but firm, and I chose the second, not with anger, but with a steady resolve that surprised even me. And when the conversation turned to future plans again, to renovations and changes, and what would be best for the house, I spoke up, my voice calm and even, and I said that I had already been reviewing my finances and my property documents, and that I had scheduled a meeting with my attorney the following week to make sure everything was arranged exactly the way I wanted, and the effect was immediate, not dramatic, but unmistakable, because the air in the room shifted again, this time not away from me, but toward me. And she paused, just for a second, her smile tightening at the edges, while my son looked at me with a mixture of surprise and something else, something like uncertainty, as if he was seeing me from a different angle for the first time in years. And I continued without raising my voice, explaining that I believed in planning ahead and making clear decisions so there would be no confusion later, and that my home, the one I had worked for over decades, was not something I would be handing over casually or discussing without proper consideration, and I made sure my tone was not defensive but factual, as if I were simply stating something obvious, and that seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have, because she had been expecting silence, or perhaps quiet agreement, not a boundary drawn so cleanly in the middle of a pleasant evening, and I could see her recalculating, adjusting her expression, choosing her next words more carefully now, and for the first time that night, I felt the balance shift slightly back in my favor, not because I had won anything, but because I had made it clear that I was not unaware, and I was not unprepared. And as the conversation moved on, I stayed present, listening more than speaking, gathering information the way I wished I had done sooner, noting how often certain topics came up, how quickly they tried to steer things away from anything that involved legal clarity, and how my son avoided meeting my eyes when those moments happened. And it hurt. Of course it did. But beneath that hurt, there was something stronger growing. A quiet determination that I would not be erased from my own story, not by manipulation, not by convenience, not even by the people I had loved the most. And by the time the evening finally began to wind down, I was no longer the woman who had walked into that dinner hoping for warmth and connection. I was someone else, someone who understood that love without respect is fragile, and that if I wanted to protect what I had built, I would have to do it myself, one clear decision at a time. By the time I finished reviewing the documents that afternoon, the quiet truth settled into my bones heavier than any accusation ever could, because nothing in those pages was accidental and nothing had been done in confusion. It had been planned, signed, and executed with a calmness that mirrored the way she smiled at me across the dinner table just days before. And that was the moment I understood that this was not about misunderstanding or generational differences or even resentment. This was about removal, about erasing me from a life I had spent 40 years building piece by piece. And strangely enough, that realization did not break me. It steadied me. Because when someone shows you that level of intention, you are no longer guessing. You are no longer hoping. You are finally seeing clearly, and clarity is a powerful thing for a woman who has spent most of her life putting others first. So I folded the papers neatly, placed them back into the envelope, and sat there in my kitchen where every cabinet, every chair, every small imperfection held a memory of sacrifice, and I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to grieve not just what they had done, but who I thought they were, because the son I raised would never have allowed this. And yet the man he had become had signed his name without hesitation, and that truth needed to be acknowledged before anything else could happen. But after those 5 minutes passed, something inside me shifted into a quiet resolve that felt unfamiliar but deeply right, because I realized I had been reacting to their actions when I should have been preparing my own. And for the first time in a long time, I began thinking not as a mother trying to hold her family together, but as a woman protecting her future. And that required distance, patience, and most importantly, silence, because people who believe they have already won tend to reveal far more than they should. So I said nothing when she called that evening with her usual overly sweet tone asking if I had received the mail. I said nothing when my son casually mentioned that they were considering reorganizing some financial responsibilities, and I certainly said nothing when they invited me to another family dinner as if nothing had changed. Because I needed them comfortable, I needed them certain that their plan was working, and while they played their roles, I quietly began putting my own affairs in order, starting with the one thing they clearly underestimated, which was my understanding of everything my late husband and I had built together. Because while they saw an aging woman slowing down, what they failed to see was the same woman who had balanced budgets, negotiated contracts, and kept this family afloat during years when nothing was certain, and that version of me had not disappeared. It had simply been ignored. So I made a few phone calls, I asked the right questions, and I listened carefully, and with every answer I received, the picture became clearer, not just of what they had done, but of what I needed to do next. And for the first time since I opened that envelope, I felt something close to peace, not because the situation was resolved, but because I was no longer standing in the dark wondering how it would unfold. I was stepping into it fully aware, fully prepared, and quietly determined that when the time came, I would not raise my voice, I would not create a scene, I would simply act, and that would be enough. The dinner invitation came 2 days later, and by then I had already made enough quiet progress to understand exactly how carefully I needed to move. So when I arrived at their house that evening, I carried myself the same way I always had, with a gentle smile, a small container of homemade food in my hands, and no visible sign that anything had changed, because the truth is, people rarely look for cracks in someone they believe they have already weakened, and that assumption gave me an advantage I had never needed before, but now intended to use fully. So I stepped inside, took in the familiar layout that I had helped design years ago, and noticed immediately how comfortable they both seemed, how relaxed her posture was, how casually my son greeted me, as if we were still living in a version of reality that no longer existed. And I realized in that moment that they had convinced themselves that what they were doing was not only justified but already complete, which made what I needed to do next both simpler and more delicate, because overconfidence often reveals timing, and timing was everything now. So I listened more than I spoke, I observed more than I reacted, and as the evening unfolded, Small details began to surface in ways they likely did not even notice. A passing comment about upcoming paperwork, a brief mention of meeting with an advisor, a subtle glance exchanged between them when certain topics came up, and each of those moments added another piece to the puzzle that I had already begun assembling. And instead of confronting them, instead of questioning anything directly, I asked simple, harmless questions delivered with the same tone of curiosity I had used for decades, because I knew that if I pushed too hard, they would retreat, but if I remained exactly who they expected me to be, they would continue speaking freely. And that is exactly what happened, because by the time dessert was served, I had learned more in 2 hours of quiet listening than I would have gained from any argument. And with every word they shared, my path forward became clearer, not fueled by anger, but guided by precision, because this was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about protecting what was mine in a way that could not be undone. And as I sat there, nodding softly while she spoke about future plans that conveniently excluded me, I felt something settle inside me again, that same calm certainty that had begun forming in my kitchen, only now it was stronger, more defined, because I was no longer reacting to a discovery, I was executing a plan, and plans require discipline, which meant resisting the urge to reveal anything too soon. Even when certain words cut deeper than I expected, even when my own son spoke about decisions that directly affected my life as if I were no longer part of it, I did not interrupt. I did not correct him, because I understood something he did not, which was that control does not come from speaking louder. It comes from knowing when to remain silent. And when the evening finally came to an end, I stood up, thanked them sincerely for dinner, and looked at both of them with the same steady expression, knowing that everything they believed about this situation was about to be tested, just not in the way they imagined. And as I drove home under the quiet glow of streetlights, I did not feel defeated. I did not feel abandoned. I felt prepared, because the next steps were no longer uncertain. They were deliberate, measured, and entirely within my control. The silence in the room did not feel like peace. It felt like the kind of quiet that comes after a truth has finally been spoken out loud and can no longer be taken back. And I could see it settling over every face at that table, including Daniel's, whose eyes no longer held that easy certainty he once carried when he stood beside his wife without question, because now he knew. Now he understood that the documents he had signed without reading were not small formalities, but carefully constructed steps in a plan that excluded me entirely. And I watched as he slowly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor in a way that sounded louder than it should have, as if even the house itself was reacting to what had just been uncovered. And Claire, for the first time since I had known her, looked uncertain, not frightened, not yet, but unsettled in a way that told me she had not expected resistance. She had expected compliance. She had expected me to sit quietly, to accept whatever version of reality she presented, just as I had done for so many years. But that version of me no longer existed, and I could feel the shift within myself. Not anger, not bitterness, but a calm clarity that came from finally seeing things as they truly were. And Daniel's voice, when it came, was lower than usual, controlled but strained as he asked her why my name had been removed, why the house that I had paid for, maintained, and lived in for decades had suddenly become something I needed permission to remain in. And Claire's response was quick, almost rehearsed, speaking about financial planning, about efficiency, about how it was easier this way, but every word sounded thinner than the last, because excuses lose their strength once the truth is already standing in the room. And I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached into my bag and placed another envelope on the table, sliding it toward Daniel. And when he opened it, his eyes moved faster this time, scanning lines that were no longer written by Claire's lawyer but by mine. Documents that outlined the actual ownership of the property, the original deed, that still bore my name. The legal protections I had quietly secured weeks before, because something in me had sensed that I needed to be prepared, even before I could fully admit why. And the realization hit him in a way that words alone could not, that everything he had assumed was already decided was in fact not finalized at all. And Claire's composure cracked just slightly as she leaned forward, asking what this meant, her tone sharper now, less controlled, and I met her gaze steadily as I explained. in the same even voice I had used all evening, that nothing had been transferred, nothing had been signed away without my full consent, and that the papers she had presented were drafts, intentions perhaps, but not reality. And for the first time, she had no immediate response, because the foundation she had been standing on was no longer solid. And Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face in a gesture I recognized from when he was a boy trying to process something too large all at once. And in that moment, I saw not just my son but the years between us, the distance that had quietly grown while I convinced myself that staying silent was the same as keeping peace. And I realized that silence had not protected anything. It had only allowed others to rewrite my place in my own life. And so I spoke again, not to accuse, not to argue, but to state clearly that I would not be leaving my home, that I would not be written out of decisions that directly affected me, and that whatever future they had imagined would have to be reconsidered with the truth in place. And as I sat there, hands folded calmly in front of me, I understood that this was not a moment of destruction, it was a moment of correction, and whether they accepted it or resisted it was no longer something I needed to control, because for the first time in a long time, I was no longer asking for my place, I was simply taking it back. Daniel did not speak immediately after my words settled into the room, and that silence carried more weight than any argument he could have made, because it was the kind of silence that comes when someone begins to question not just a situation, but the choices that led them there. And I could see it in the way his posture shifted, no longer leaning toward Claire as he had done for years, but sitting back as if he needed space to think clearly for the first time in a long while. And Claire noticed it too, her eyes moving between us with a growing tension that she tried to mask with composure, but it was no longer as effortless as before, and when she finally spoke again, her tone had changed, less confident, more defensive, as she insisted that everything she had done was for the good of the family, that simplifying ownership, reducing complications, planning ahead, these were responsible decisions. But her words no longer filled the room the way they once might have. Because now there was context, now there was evidence, and most importantly, now there was resistance, and Daniel slowly turned his head toward her, asking a question that seemed simple but carried years of unspoken trust behind it. He asked why I had not been included in those discussions, why something so important had been handled without even a conversation with me. And Claire hesitated, just for a moment. But it was enough, because hesitation reveals what confidence tries to hide. And in that small pause, the truth became clearer than any explanation she could offer, and I remained still, allowing them to face that realization without interruption, because this was not about me convincing anyone anymore. It was about them seeing what had always been there. And Daniel exhaled slowly, his hand resting flat against the table as if grounding himself. And then he said something that shifted everything again. He said that nothing further would be signed, nothing would move forward, until everything was reviewed properly, together. And that word, together, lingered in the air in a way that made Claire's expression tighten, because it represented a balance she had not planned for, a presence she had tried to minimize, and I could see the calculations behind her eyes, the quiet reworking of a plan that no longer fit the circumstances. But this time, she was no longer the only one making decisions, and I felt a quiet strength settle deeper within me, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that holds its ground without needing permission. And I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip, not to fill the silence, but to show that I was no longer affected by it, that the tension in the room did not belong to me anymore. And when I set the glass back down, I spoke once more, gently but firmly, explaining that I had already arranged for a legal review of all documents related to the property, that I had met with an attorney who ensured that my rights were protected, and that any future decisions would require my direct involvement, my direct approval, and my full understanding. And Daniel nodded, not quickly, not automatically, but thoughtfully, as if he was finally processing each detail instead of accepting it at face value. And Claire leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms in a way that signaled both frustration and restraint, because she understood now that pushing further in this moment would only reveal more than she intended, and the balance of control had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And as the room settled into this new reality, I realized something even more important than the documents or the house itself. I realized that the role I had been quietly moved out of was no longer something anyone else could define, because I had stepped back into it on my own terms, and whatever came next, whether it was reconciliation or distance, would begin from a place where I was no longer overlooked, no longer managed, but fully present and fully seen. By the time the afternoon light stretched across the hardwood floors of the living room, everything they thought they controlled had already slipped quietly out of their hands, and I could see it in the way Melissa's smile began to stiffen as more relatives arrived and settled into the chairs I had arranged with deliberate care, each place set not just for comfort, but for clarity, because today was not just another family gathering. It was the moment the truth would stand on its own without me raising my voice even once, and I remained seated in my usual armchair, the same one Daniel used to insist I rest in after long days, watching as my son avoided my eyes and my daughter-in-law busied herself in the kitchen as if movement alone could protect her from what she already sensed was coming. And when Pastor Williams stepped through the door right on time, carrying that calm presence that always made people listen a little closer, the room shifted in a way no one could ignore, because his presence meant intention. It meant something had been planned beyond polite conversation, and I noticed how Melissa paused mid-step, her hand tightening around a glass before she forced herself to keep moving, pretending nothing had changed, but everything had. And when I finally stood up, slowly, without hurry, every conversation softened into silence, not because I demanded it, but because they felt it, that quiet authority that only comes from someone who has nothing left to fear losing. And I thanked everyone for coming in a steady voice, the kind that carries not through volume, but through certainty. And then I turned slightly toward Pastor Williams, giving him a small nod, and he understood, unfolding the documents with the same careful respect he would give to a Sunday sermon, explaining in simple, measured words that what he held was a legally notarized statement, one that clarified recent misunderstandings regarding property, finances, and authority, and I watched as confusion flickered across faces, then concern, then realization began to take root, because piece by piece, he outlined the truth, that the house remained solely in my name, that no transfer had been completed, that the power of attorney Melissa believed she held had never been finalized due to discrepancies that required further review, discrepancies I had quietly ensured would never be resolved in her favor, and I could hear the subtle shift in breathing across the room as people began connecting what had been hidden. And when Melissa finally stepped forward, her voice tight but controlled, asking what this meant, I met her gaze without anger, without bitterness, only clarity, and I told her gently that it meant nothing had been taken from me, that nothing had ever truly belonged to her, and that every decision moving forward would be made by me, on my terms. And for the first time since she entered this family, she had no script to follow, no performance to hide behind, because the audience now saw the truth without needing me to accuse or explain, and my son sat there, silent, caught between the woman he chose and the mother he underestimated, and I did not rescue him from that moment, because some lessons must settle slowly to be understood, and as the room remained still, I added one final piece, my voice unwavering, that I had already arranged new legal protections, new financial structures, and most importantly, new boundaries, and that while I did not wish harm or hardship on anyone, I would no longer sacrifice my dignity for the illusion of peace. And in that silence that followed, heavier than any argument, I felt something shift inside me, not anger, not sadness, but release, because for the first time in a long while, I was no longer reacting to betrayal, I was standing beyond it, and they all knew it, whether they spoke or not. No one spoke immediately after my words settled into the room, and that silence revealed more than any argument ever could, because it was no longer about confusion or misunderstanding. It was about recognition, and I could see it clearly as Melissa's posture shifted. Her shoulders no longer held high with quiet confidence, but drawn slightly inward as if she were trying to gather control that had already slipped beyond her reach. And my son finally looked at me, not with defiance, not even with anger, but with something far more difficult to confront, the realization that he had misjudged the very person who had spent a lifetime protecting him. And I did not rush to fill that silence for him, because this was not a moment that needed my guidance, it needed his awareness, and so I simply returned to my seat, folding my hands calmly in my lap as the weight of truth continued to settle across the room like a slow and steady tide, and Pastor Williams, understanding that his role was complete, gave a respectful nod before stepping back, allowing the family to absorb what had been made clear without further explanation, and it was my sister Margaret who quietly broke the silence first, her voice gentle but firm as she said that perhaps it was time for everyone to be honest with one another, not in accusation, but in accountability. And that single sentence shifted the atmosphere from tension to something more grounded, because it invited reflection instead of defense, and Melissa opened her mouth as if to respond. But for once, there was no carefully chosen narrative waiting, no polished explanation ready to redirect the truth, and she hesitated, which told everyone more than any words could have, and my son finally stood, running a hand across his face as he took a slow breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard in years, admitting that he should have asked more questions, that he should have listened more carefully, and that somewhere along the way, he had allowed convenience to replace responsibility, and I listened without interrupting, not because I needed an apology, but because I needed him to understand the depth of what had been lost, not the house, not the documents, but trust, and trust is not something restored with a single sentence or a single afternoon. And when he turned toward Melissa, there was no anger in his expression, only a quiet expectation, as if he were finally seeing her without the filter he had worn for so long. And she straightened slightly, meeting his gaze, and though her voice remained controlled, there was a strain beneath it as she said that she had only been trying to secure their future, that everything she had done was out of concern for stability. And I did not dismiss her words, because intentions often sound reasonable when spoken aloud. But I calmly responded that stability built on assumption and exclusion is not stability at all. It is control, and control does not belong in a family that claims to value respect. And again, I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated what had already been proven, and that was enough, because the truth does not need decoration to be understood. And as the conversation slowly began to move again, softer now, more careful, I realized that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how they saw me, but in how I saw myself. Because for years I had measured my role by how much I could give, how much I could tolerate, how much I could overlook in the name of keeping the family together. But sitting there in that room, I understood that holding a family together should never require diminishing oneself, and that realization did not come with bitterness. It came with clarity, and as people began to gather their things, offering quiet words, thoughtful glances, and in some cases sincere apologies, I did not cling to any of it. Because this was not about collecting regret, it was about establishing truth, and truth, once revealed, does not need to be defended, it simply stands. And for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel the quiet strength of that truth without the weight of needing anyone else to validate it.